make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
And ultimately what that move to colorblindness does is it allows you to take race out of the supposed equation and talk about other things instead. So for instance, just to follow the thread back with those segregationist Christians I were talking about who didn't want public schools to integrate because God didn't want the races to mix. By the time the schools finally begin to integrate in 1968 and 1969, 15 years after the Brown decision, you have an exodus of all these white parents from these schools, but they're not saying it's because God doesn't want us to mix. Instead, what they're saying is, well, this is about quality of education.
Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, we're so glad to have you. I am your political host, Will Wright, and joined by my trusty sidekick, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks, Will.
And joining us this week is Rusty Hawkins. He is a historian of American religion and race and also a professor at Indiana Wesleyan University. He's a co-editor of the powerful and timely book, The Bible Told Them So. I got the so wrong. The Bible Told Them So, how Southern Evangelicals Fought to Preserve White Supremacy, which is probably one of the best books I've read about this topic in this period in the state. I mean, it's just I'm gonna give you more accolades here in a second, but welcome to the show, Rusty.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I wanna just kind of give you a bit of the origins of how I came about your book, because most people that we talk to on the show about their books, their publishers will reach out to us, and for the most part, we really do try to read every single book that comes across like our desk that gets sent to us. Sometimes we don't get a chance to read them as in depth as we would like, but we do open them up and we flip to the pages. That said, the past couple of weeks, I've been on this kick of like rereading books I didn't get a chance to read very often. So I was reading Anthea Butler's book, White Evangelical Racism. We had her on the show. Robbie Jones' book, the Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I think is what it's called. And there was a period where I didn't have another book to read. And I'm like, oh, why not? I'm just going to find a book. So I went on like Apple Books, was looking for books kind of in the genre, and I came across your book. And I'm like, oh, okay. Knew nothing about you, knew nothing about the book, read it. And I swear anyone that's been listening to our show knows I've been recommending it to every single person that has been on. Like, have you read Rusty Hawkins' book? So I'm just so thankful that you decided to come on the show, because now I can actually talk to you because I read your book from cover to cover. So tell me, why did you write this book?
Well, thanks for that. I mean, that was thanks for the glowing recommendation. Thanks for telling people. And I got to say that's kind of, I'm glad to hear that, because that's really the reason I wrote the book was for folks like you and for folks like Josh and kind of the folks at your church. Like a lot of historians of American history, I wrote this book in large part to try to make sense of my own autobiographical background. So I grew up evangelical. I still identify as an evangelical Christian with a lot of caveats because the term has become so politicized recently that while I still identify as an evangelical Christian, I was like, but let me tell you what that doesn't mean. But so
essentially, evangelical is like the new Thunderbolts with the asterisk, right?
That's right. That's right. But for me, that just meant I grew up in an environment with, like James Dobson was on the radio, and Salty the Singing Songbook was part of my repertoire growing up. And I mean, I just kind of grew up in that subculture. And I was coming of age at a time when race was increasingly on my radar, because I was growing up around the time that Rodney King was beaten by members of the LAPD, and the uprising or protests or riots, depending on where you fall in the political spectrum, that resulted from that. And that was followed quickly by O.J. Simpson's trial. And that was when I was a senior in high school. So race was on my radar a lot at that critical time when you're coming of age in later high school. And it was around that same time that I also, for the first time, heard a racist joke in church. And I should get you a little bit more about my background. I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, which is a part of the metropolitan area that in the 1970s, when I was born, a lot of white families were moving out of. My family, my parents chose to move into Kansas City, Kansas, not for any idealistic reasons or ideological reasons, or really even any reasons other than the fact they wanted to be close to their church. And they attended a Free Methodist church. I was born and raised Free Methodist, and the one Free Methodist church in Kansas City was in a part of the city that was experiencing some white flight as a result of busing in the 1970s. But as a result of their decision, I grew up in a part of the city that was racially diverse, grew up in a neighborhood that was racially diverse. My sisters and I went to the public schools in Kansas City, which were racially diverse, and had this racial diversity be very much part of my experience, except for on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights and Sunday nights at Aldersgate Free Methodist Church. So I was in one world in which racial diversity was talked about, was celebrated, was something that we said in school we embraced. And then on Sunday morning, to hear a racist joke in the sanctuary of Aldersgate Free Methodist Church created this huge disconnect in my brain. And I went off to college. I went to Wheaton College outside Chicago, evangelical school, and kind of had these same kind of weird conversations about race, even at Wheaton, with folks and people who just had different perspectives about racial diversity, and people who really kind of approached the issue of race as something to be avoided, and something that if we just stop talking about it, if we just let it go away, if we just stop scratching at that scar, that's the only way we're going to get past this. And for people to keep bringing it up was causing a problem. And so I kind of had all this kind of working in the back of my mind, and then ended up going to Rice University in Houston, Texas for graduate school in history, and just providentially showed up at Rice University at the same time. There was a sociologist there named Michael Emerson, who had just recently written a book called Divided by Faith, which I read it before I knew who Michael Emerson was, before I showed up at Rice. And that book just sociologically just explained all these experiences that I was having at Wheaton, at Aldersgate Free Methodist Church, in ways that made me want to ask, what is the historical background to this sociology that Michael Emerson's writing about? And so I wanted to write a book that would explain how my people, how white evangelicals kind of got to this point in the late 20th century and then early 21st century, where color-blindness was seen as the avenue forward and what we should be trying to achieve. And these, the idea that race is being something to be avoided, I knew that if that was the problem as I was seeing it in my people, then I needed to find a time in history where they weren't going to be quiet about race. And I figured that if I studied the civil rights movement and started looking at what white Christians are saying about race during the civil rights movement, I'd probably find a time when people were on the record saying things. So that's what kind of drove me to study the civil rights period as my focus in graduate school. And that's ultimately what produced this book, The Bible Told Them So.
So I would love to hear the basically kind of an overview of what did the white church say about race, and maybe that's way too broad of a generalization. Maybe it's not. However specific you need to get about it. But what was said on the record about race when in your studies on the civil rights movement?
Yeah. So I started looking at this, and I started around 1954 in my book. And 1954 is a pivotal year in American history because that is when the Supreme Court hands down the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so 1954 kind of becomes this marker in the historical timeline of when white Southerners in particular start getting really anxious about these changes that they see coming for their society. It's important for me to say, too, that in the 1950s, when you're talking about Southerners in particular, the social scientific survey data we have from that period means that when we're talking about white Southerners, we're talking about people who 9 out of 10 of them in 1954 identify as Christians. So they are folks that are deeply embedded in the Bible Belt, deeply identify as Christians themselves. And so 1954 is where I start surveying what they're saying, start reading their letters, start reading the petitions, start reading the memos, start reading the different votes they're taking in their congregations. And what I'm finding out in 1954 is that these white Christians are saying that this Supreme Court decision that's handed down is something that goes against God's will, because as they read it in the Bible, God himself was the author of racial segregation. And so this move that the Supreme Court tends to put our country on, in their eyes, in 1954, towards integration, is a move that they ultimately see as being against God's will. And they do this, as the title of my book suggests, they don't just come to these decisions willy-nilly. They come to these decisions by reading the Bible. And so they're backing up their arguments with particular biblical passages that in their mind suggest that God doesn't want them to mix. And I kind of document this in one of the chapters of the book, but I try to be as thorough as possible and pull from as many different sources as I have in terms of documenting how from Genesis to Revelation, these Christians kind of go through and make almost any passage fit their segregationist tendencies. So it starts as early as the Tower of Babel passage in Genesis. And they talk about how God there, the Tower of Babel, separated people into different groups, which they came to see as different racial groups. And then pretty consistently through the rest of the Old Testament, anytime that God is telling Israel to not to intermix with other people groups, not to intermarry, not to intermix, this was the same way that God then was instructing people of different races not to intermix with each other. And it just keeps going through the New Testament. If there's one verse that carries more weight for these segregationists than anyone else, it's Acts 17:26. This is a passage when Paul is in the marketplace in Athens, and he's preaching about these to these people with this marker to an unknown God, and he's talking about who this God was, and said that God has made from the blood of one man all of mankind, and has set the bounds of their habitation. And this was a particular fond passage for segregationists, because the first half of that verse was a verse that a lot of civil rights activists, people who are supportive of racial integration, used and pulled from it. That, hey, look, God created from just one man all of us, so we're all brothers in God's plan. And the segregationists loved this verse because they said, yes, but you're proof texting. You're not giving us the whole verse there, because in the second part of that sentence, Paul said, and he set the bounds of habitation for mankind after he created them. So that is, he separated them and said you shouldn't mix with each other. I take this all the way even through Revelation 7:9. And Revelation 7:9 today is heralded even among those in racial reconciliation movements as this beautiful image of what it's going to be like worshiping before the throne, where it says people of every tribe and tongue will be worshiping before the throne. In the eyes of segregationists in the 1950s and 60s, they said, see, even that though is evidence that God is a segregationist, because there's still going to be different tribes and tongues even in heaven. And so if we start mixing everyone together down here on earth, then we're violating God's will. So these are the types of things in the 1950s when the civil rights movement is on the horizon still, and integration is still coming, that these Christian white Southerners are pushing back hard against and using the Bible as their justification for doing so.
Your book focuses a lot on South Carolina. What was the purpose of that, and what's so significant about South Carolina?
Yeah, great question. South Carolina became the case study for my book simply because when I went into the project, there was going to be the South writ large, and I quickly found out that was might take the rest of my life if I didn't start narrowing it down. So, South Carolina became the case study for me for a couple of reasons. One is because South Carolina is just really understudied in the civil rights historiography. So Alabama gets a lot of attention, and Mississippi gets a lot of attention, and even Georgia gets a lot of attention. These other deep South states get a lot of attention. South Carolina was kind of like understudied. So I was kind of drawn to that because I thought it was fertile ground for a civil rights historian to dig into. But also, South Carolina had a really strong private school movement. And that was part of my story at the end, is how the Christian parent response to school integration was to support private schools, private Christian schools as a result of integrated schools. And so South Carolina's history among a leader of private schools was a big reason for that. And I ended up focusing just on Methodists and Baptists, Southern Baptists and Southern Methodists in my study. And South Carolina had a bigger percentage of Methodists than any of these other states. So it kind of just presented a lot of convenient and helpful ground zero to conduct research on a project like this. That's why South Carolina kind of rose to the fore. But I also kind of point out that South Carolina is a case study, but I also find it to be representative of these other southern states that are part of this process as well.
Yeah, so your book is essentially, right, just to make sure I understand, it's demonstrating a line that moves from Jim Crow segregationist theology and its underpinnings to the kind of colorblindness that I essentially grew up hearing about.
And
you
I
kind
did
of,
too, right.
yeah, I mean, you kind of mapped that out, and I think it's so interesting and something everyone should be thinking about, because I thought about colorblindness, and it's like, oh yeah, colorblind. Well, that was always seen as such a good thing, I don't see color, and I would hear people say that, and I always felt a little disingenuous, like, really, you don't see color? I mean, I don't know, okay, but you felt like that was the thing. At least somehow I felt like that was what I needed to say, or that was a good principle to kind of explain and view race by, and yet we see that this has some roots that are more nefarious than I probably knew about. One thing I think is fascinating is that this idea that it wasn't just the leaders that were pushing this, but actually a lot of the congregation, the congregations that had the ability to fire pastors, especially in, I guess, a congregationalist background, which has Baptist, maybe probably some other denominations in there as well. But I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about that. Like, what was the pressure from congregations at the time? How was their view, and how did that affect pastors that might kind of feel stuck, or even maybe they're trying to be like speak against segregation, but they couldn't, or they were stopped?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the congregation was everything. I mean, the position the congregation took kind of dictated the position the church took. And obviously this is true in a congregationalist polity like Baptist, where the congregation sets the terms of the church and the way it functions and who their pastor is going to be. So it makes sense in that kind of context that, of course, the congregation's view is going to be represented by the pastor. And at the point the pastor doesn't represent those views, especially in something so volatile such as race, the congregation dismisses the pastor. So I tell a couple of stories in the book of Baptist preachers. But what I found even more fascinating was that the Methodists have this Episcopal polity in which a bishop is the one who assigns a preacher or pastor to a Methodist church. But even in that context, pastors of the Methodist denomination who were appointed by bishops who fell out of line with their congregation on this issue found themselves even run out. And that wasn't supposed to happen. I mean, you're supposed to have the security of a bishop having your back, but this issue was volatile enough in the 50s and 60s that even Methodist ministers were the ones who also kind of were pushed out if they fell on the wrong side of their congregation. I will say that oftentimes when it was this division between the congregation and the pastor, if there's a division that existed there, it's because the congregation was supportive of Jim Crow segregation, and it's the pastor who is out of step. But there were plenty of examples of the pastor and the congregation being in lockstep on these things, both in support of segregation. So I didn't find any churches in which the pastor supported segregation and the congregation didn't. I did find some in which the pastor supported integration and the congregation didn't. But the true story
that tells
was
you something, huh?
It does. But most of the stories were the ones in which the congregation and the pastor both agreed that integration was against God's will.
You know, that's so interesting because I was thinking to myself, like did racism, this is like chicken egg, right? Like, did racism proliferate more because of the pastor's message to the congregants, or were the congregants like changed because they thought that being a good Christian also meant to like believe in segregation? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think
like, is there an answer to that?
I think my answer is like yes. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that. But I think it was kind of like mutually reinforcing or self-reinforcing. So
yeah, it's almost it's a self-licking ice cream cone, as I like to say. Where, I mean, because pastors do have an effect, and you see a lot of that even today. You know, here we are, whatever, 70 years later. Churches that are, say, very Trumpy generally have a very Trumpy pastor. And you don't tend to see a church or a Trumpy pastor preach to a bunch of libs or whatever. so it's kind of like, I mean, I don't know. It's so weird. We could probably do a whole episode about the sociology of how congregants find churches. But I do want to go back to something earlier you did say to keep us on track. You used the word color-blindness.
Yeah.
I think you did a really great job sort of explaining kind of the origins of color-blindness. I'd love for you to just unpack that for us. Like, where does this term come from? And basically, how was it used to convince people that, it's okay for us to still be racist?
Yeah. So let me pick up the story. So where I last left off, you had all these Christians who are turning to the Bible and making these arguments and writing their congressional representatives to say, don't vote for the Civil Rights Act, don't vote for the Voting Rights Act. These are going to destroy our Christian civilization down here. But these Civil Rights Act gets passed and the Voting Rights Act gets passed, and it turns out that a critical mass of Americans don't support the same view. And actually, while Southerners by the early 1960s are overwhelmingly opposed to integration, by the end of the 1960s, they're kind of like the public opinion seems to be shifting on this. And so the question becomes then, so what happens to these arguments? Do these people just say, oh, I guess we were wrong? And this is where I in the second half of my book kind of trace out then, so how do these same folks that were fighting for about a decade against integration then kind of make their peace with it when it comes? And the argument that I make in the book is that, well, if you follow the thread, what you'll find out is that once the tipping point is reached and American culture starts backing integration and starts getting behind this idea that Jim Crow segregation is an affront to American democracy and we need to do away with it, what these segregationist Christians are left with was then a society in which more attention is being given to becoming more diverse. And so in denominations like the Methodist Church, which, quick backstory, the Methodists in 1848, don't quote me on that, before the Civil War, they split over the issue of slavery. In 1939, they come back together. But when the Methodist Church comes back together in 1939, it builds in for white Southerners segregation within the denomination. And so in 1939, the Methodist Church, North and South, reunites, but it does so as a Jim Crow church that has a built-in, it's called the central jurisdiction. And it basically takes all black churches in the denomination nationwide, and it puts that in this central jurisdiction, irrespective of their geography, which is not the way the Methodists work. But what happens by 1968, the Methodist denomination is like, I can't believe that we still have this Jim Crow feature in our church. We need to do away with this. And we need to make sure that we are integrating our church structures. We need to make sure that our church boards are representative of the racial diversity of our denomination. We need to be intentional about setting aside a certain percentage of our church structure that is going to go to Black Methodists. And so there is this intentionality about being racially diverse. And this is the moment that those segregationist Christians come back with this new weapon. And what they start saying is, see, this is the problem. We've gone too far. And what we need to do is be more attentive or be less attentive to race. We need to stop talking about this. The more we talk about race, the more problem this is going to be. Now, this is really rich coming from these Christians who for a decade before this have been talking about we can't integrate, God doesn't want us to mix, God doesn't want us to mix. But at the point they lost that battle, they fashioned this new tool of just being colorblind. So they don't call themselves as being colorblind, but they just say, we have paid way too much attention to race, and we're becoming obsessed with race, and we're no longer preaching the gospel. The argument that I'm making is that this was kind of like this proto-colorblindness, and they start this new move within these conservative circles of saying that the best way forward for race is just to ignore race. And they hand this thing down to their children and to their children. And so, like to Josh's point, and to the point I started with at the beginning at Aldersgate Free Methodist Church, I was brought up with the same kind of tool of colorblindness, where like I was told that like the problem is we pay too much attention to race, and these race cards that are always played, these are to the detriment. And we're never going to make any progress if we just keep talking about race. But fundamentally, what that colorblindness did was keep us from making practical steps to improve race relations or to dismantle unjust structures that continued or perpetuated in American society, because white Christians just denied they were even there, because we had been kind of like conditioned with this idea of colorblindness to deny that they even existed. And so that's kind of like where I end my book, is this idea that I think a lot of white Christians who might even be of goodwill, wanting to see the issue of race be done away with, we are the inheritors of this tool of colorblindness that was passed down to us through the generations, which is really ineffective for addressing racial inequities. And for our ancestors who fashioned that tool of colorblindness, they would say, you're welcome. I mean, that's what we've given you. We've helped you avoid any kind of meaningful integration or racial justice, because you're using the tools that we fashioned 40 and 50 years ago. And surprise, surprise, we're not making any progress.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to think back and see the sins of the past. You know, that feels so much closer now, because right, you're talking about how we grew up, and you're talking about my parents, right, my grandparents. Certainly my grandparents by today's standards, and I don't know if my family listens to my podcast. If they do, they might get upset about this. And I love my grandparents. I mean, they were some of the best people I ever knew. And yet certainly by today's standards, I think they would be considered racist in many of their views. Probably most of them that have to do with race at all. And I heard them say things that were to that end. I mean, my dad tells stories to me about being in a church in Washington, D.C., and remembering the white flight out of Washington, D.C., because he was born there and they moved to Maryland. And so he was actually part of this, his family. And they would go and they would knock on doors, and their Sunday school teacher told them, if they answer the door and they're Black, just say, "Oh, sorry, I have the wrong address."
Wow.
They were going and they were knocking on doors to invite people to church.
Wow.
And this is what his Sunday school teacher told him to do,
Wow.
Which then on another night would have been praising Jesus, they're Pentecostal, they're speaking in tongues, giving to those in need, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And yet you have this massive blind spot, it seems. And I just really my question is about how could they have so massive of a blind spot, I guess, is my question to you from your research, what you think about that. But even just kind of thinking about like how they did their exegesis, how did they come to something like Acts 17:26 and come up with that out of their rigorous examination of original context, or do they just not do that at all? I'm just curious as to in your research, how would you answer or respond to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I this doesn't come out in my research as much as it does just kind of like my persistent conversations with students that I have in classes through the years. But I kind of feel like the way that blind spot developed is through kind of a really stunted understanding of reconciliation in the gospel, as reconciliation being central to what the gospel message is. And I think that a lot of white evangelicals in particular, if they think about reconciliation at all, they think about it as reconciliation between themselves and God, and themselves as an individual between themselves and God. But the idea that reconciliation is something the gospel promises across people groups is something that is so foreign to many evangelicals who just see the world through this individualized lens of me and God and my relationship with God, that I think that's how that blind spot develops. So the idea that a church like a church in Antioch, where Jews and Gentiles start worshiping together, and when they do, then get the name Christian for the first time because they're doing something the world hadn't seen before, or a church like the one in Ephesus that, like when Paul's talking about breaking down the dividing wall of hostility, is talking about a literal wall that existed in the city of Ephesus. I think an understanding of the context of the New Testament church as being one in which God is intent about bringing about multi-ethnic worship as a testament to the reconciling power of the death, burial, resurrection in Jesus Christ is something that is just so absent in so much of our theology as white evangelicals that it develops this blind spot. So if you knock on someone's door and they don't look like you, rather than seeing that as an opportunity then to say, here's an opportunity for interracial reconciliatory fellowship that might be possible in the church, you think about, oh, there's someone who either, charitably probably wouldn't be interested in our church, or less charitably, we don't want coming to our church, in a way that kind of those blind spots can develop. And the problem with that, of course, is that once those blind spots develop, they continue to perpetuate each other. So then we don't understand the experiences and the way that other folks read scriptures in a way that we just then reinforce our understanding of what scripture's message is and what the gospel message is, in a way that we just kind of compound the problem. And so I think that's how the blind spots develop. I think that's, if they're to be addressed, and I don't remember, Josh, if this was part of your question or not, but I mean, I think the way to address those blind spots is to first of all start out with a more robust theological understanding of what reconciliation demands of us and its centrality within the gospel message. And once you can get people on board, or if you can get people on board with the idea that this isn't like this political project we have going on the side, this is what the church is supposed to be. And if you can get like a theological buy-in, then I think the second leg of that stool then is a sociological argument. So then what are the ways in which we are unreconciled to people of different groups? And that's where I think the study of sociology really helps with that, to help illuminate the ways that there are so many inequities that continue, that persist, especially within the church. How do we address those? And then I think history is like the third leg of that, and how did we get here in the first place is really important too. Can I say one other thing? Yeah. Because Josh started your previous question about this was something that my parents and my grandparents and might have been part of their story, and something that I often bring up with students as well is that I think it's also in terms of the historical side of this, why should we pay any attention to what my grandparents did? I mean, that was so many years ago. Why don't we just like wipe the slate clean and just move on from here? One of the things that has long fascinated me for the last couple of decades is my reading of the Psalms, and how often in the Psalms, Israel's history of being unfaithful to God is a part of these Psalms that are part of this worship of God. And so you read the Psalms and it's not like, oh, we did everything great. It was like, hey, God delivered us from Egypt and then we screwed up. And then he like gave us another chance and then we screwed up again. And then he gave us, so many of the Psalms include these things that it wasn't them, it was the people behind them. And these Psalms are part of like the church's worship and just owning up to the ways you screwed up, and not you personally. I mean, obviously that's part of it, but how you're part of this tradition of people who have screwed up is part of worship. And so, to the question about why this history is important, that for that third leg of the stool, I think, there's something in Scripture that demonstrates to us that this history is important.
Greg Boyd wrote in one of his books, there's so many, that basically racial reconciliation is like basically spiritual warfare that you can see, because it is.
I love that
we all can do. We know that, racism is not great in this country, and the church had a big part to play in that. So, I definitely think churches could learn from this. But to the issue of learning, like why is this such a hard thing for the church to kind of come to terms with? Just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of how little I knew, how ignorant I was about seminary or whatever. When Josh and I first started this podcast, I was like, oh yeah, we could do a whole episode about the church's role in like segregation or whatnot. And Josh is looking at me kind of askance, like, what are you talking about? Not to say that he didn't think it was important, but it's just like in my mind, I thought in seminary, I thought that like every potential pastor would go through, class on doctrine of discovery, about segregation, about, manifest. Like in my mind, I just thought that would happen, but it doesn't. So like how do we kind of move to the next thing to kind of help us with our racial reconciliation and the church's role in that? Because, my follow-up question would be like, what is the church's blind spot today? Maybe it's still racism and the church's role in that, but, I would guess it expands to other sort of issues and demographics and whatnot.
Yeah. I think, I'll have to confess, I've not been to seminary myself, so I'm not a trained pastor by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't want to repeat what I said just a second ago, but I do think it really starts with the theology of our churches, and I think that has to be ground zero. And the extent to which our theology remains individualized and a story about how your individual redemption is part of is the purpose of the gospel, and that Jesus came and died so that you can go to heaven when you die. I think as long as that is the way that the gospel is, I don't want to say preached, but as long as that's the way it continues to be understood, then I think that we're just kind of going to spin our wheels on these things. And until we can begin to see the idea of the kingdom being more than about happening after you die, and about salvation being about healing that begins in the here and now, and can expand our theological robustness to incorporate these other ways of salvation, meaning healing, and reconciliation, meaning more than just me and God. If we can begin to do that, I think maybe we can get purchase outside of these narrow lenses. But let's also be real that we're up against a culture that doesn't talk like that. And so you can have the most compelling sermon in the world for 2 hours, and let's face it, you're not going to get 2 hours of a sermon. You get the most compelling worship service that will include a 25-minute sermon.
20 minutes of announcements.
all of that. And you're up against then 6 other days of the week and another half day on Sunday that is about, no, this whole culture is about you, and about individual. And that is what you're up against. So I don't want to say it's hopeless, but I think hope is as a Christian virtue is definitely have to play a big role in this because it seems insurmountable.
I mean, I think you're really on to something in the sense that, we've gone from so basically, as I understand your argument, this idea of colorblindness was essentially, hey, we're gonna make this like the culture shifting around us. It's no longer culturally acceptable to essentially, on a broad scale, to have these views. So as we shift them, what essentially we're gonna get rid of race. The argument kind of gets rid of race, and so what essentially happens is, if race is just about me not seeing someone else's color, so essentially, I am no longer prejudiced as an individual, which is important, which is a good thing. But what essentially that does is that kind of cordons you off from any systemic responsibility. Any responsibility on a grand scale of law, shared history, systems that might oppress, because essentially if it's just an individual issue, then it's not a corporate issue. If it's not a corporate issue, then we're not going to worry about these laws and all that stuff unless it's so clearly racist. But we're not going to worry about that because it's really about you as an individual and being colorblind. And the connection there between, like, I have my own views of this, and I'm not racist, therefore I'm good.
Right.
I'm done. I can move on.
Right.
And I would love for you to kind of talk about, like, how that is in your research, how is that correct in what I'm saying, like, kind of, and what I'm talking about there. And how that even has morphed from this colorblindness into what are the like, kind of to Will's point, where are the manifestations of this today?
Yeah.
Where can we draw that line to it today? I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Josh, you did a great job there, like further explicating my argument in ways that I kind of dropped on the earlier response to that. So yeah, that is exactly right. And ultimately what that move to colorblindness does is it allows you to take race out of the supposed equation and talk about other things instead. So for instance, just to follow the thread back with those segregationist Christians I were talking about who didn't want public schools to integrate because God didn't want the races to mix. By the time the schools finally begin to integrate in 1968 and 1969, 15 years after the Brown decision, you have an exodus of all these white parents from these schools, but they're not saying it's because God doesn't want us to mix. Instead, what they're saying is, well, this is about quality of education. And so we're actually not going to say anything about race because race just has been taken out of the equation altogether, and it's off the table. We're not acting as racists here. We're acting as parents who are seeking the best interest of our children and giving them a quality of education. Now, these were the same people who were saying that God doesn't want us to mix, but now they're just changing the terms of the argument. They're moving the goalposts a little bit because to say in 1969 that God doesn't want us to mix no longer fits as comfortably within the larger cultural arguments as it had back in 1954. And so it's taking race out altogether. And then what that ultimately does is that you can say eventually, I've got no problem with people of different races, but you can say that once you have successfully completely cut yourself off from any meaningful interracial interaction. So you're in a new white suburb. You're in a new private Christian school that has no racial diversity in it. your church is this homogenous bubble of other white people. And so you can say, I've got no problem with people of different races. I myself am not racist. And then this whole idea about racism gets reduced down to a heart issue. And so I say it in the book. I mean, the problem with this is that you can have everyone in society who no one has a racist bone in their body anymore, and yet you have perpetuated racialized systems in American society, which inequitably reward some people and penalize other people on the basis of their race. So that's the final part of that argument. I'll also say that I think that the last, I don't know, 9 months or so have been, I feel like there are some people who are becoming more comfortable being explicitly racist again, in ways that maybe 5 years ago I would have thought that, well, whether or not white Christians agree with this argument, they know that they're not supposed to disagree with it publicly. And I think the last couple of years, but I think the last 9 months in particular have kind of made me rethink that I think there are more and more white Christians who are quite comfortable being explicitly racist in ways that I wouldn't have guessed. I wouldn't have guessed 5 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. I'm curious. So you wrote this book 2021. So it's been 4 years now. I'd love for you to give us a take on how the book was received, because having spoken to Anthea Butler and Jamar Tisby, like when they write books kind of on this subject, like their responses are what you would probably expect they would be. So I'm curious, like how are people, or how did people receive your book?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, my unlike Dr. Butler and Dr. Tisby's book, my book was with an academic press, it's Oxford University Press, and it was written, I mean, my hope was that it made its way into the church, but it's not a one that found the same widespread readership that the color compromise or white evangelical racism got. So overall, the reaction that I've gotten from the book has been positive, but I also think there's some self-selectivity. The people who read it are other historians who appreciate the historical research, or folks who picked it up because they're interested in the subject and found the receipts compelling, I guess.
I would love for you to help me make the connection, if there is one, to the angst about CRT in the white evangelical church, Southern Baptist Convention. Obviously it's not just them, in my own circles that I've ran in most of my life, CRT was not popular, or anything that looked like that, right? It's more contemporary in the sense that in its popular forms for a broad audience, it's more contemporary. I know the history of CRT goes back into the 80s and 70s and even further in terms of scholarship. I would just love to hear like your thoughts and musings, and if you have from research, that'd be great, but I just would love to hear your thoughts. What are the similarities? What are the differences between this strong push against CRT in white evangelical churches, or evangelical churches? I'm guessing there's not a strong push in minority evangelical churches, but I don't know. What's the similarities? What's the differences? Are we talking about something that's like a grandchild of this segregationist thinking, or is it something in a complete different line of thinking that just looks similar?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly because, I mean, even CRT, it's interesting how CRT very quickly gave way to DEI. And so we don't hear really anything about CRT anymore, but 3 years ago it was all CRT.
Yes.
And today it's all DEI. But I think, again, a charitable read of people's objection to CRT could be some of the ways in which it's couched in terms of this idea that there is, critical race theory had as part of its element the idea that there is no neutral ground, that either you are, if you're status quo, if you're not actively anti-racist, you're perpetuating a racist system.
Right.
And the idea that everyone is part of groups, and so there's
which I don't even necessarily agree with, right?
Sure,
I'm not saying that,
So if there is objections on those grounds, I mean, charitably speaking, I think that might be why some people objected. I think that most people didn't. I don't think that there's a whole lot of people who push back against CRT that ever understood it at that level. I think more to the point that they were told that CRT is bad because it has the same kind of roots and comes out of a Marxist school of thought, whatever that means. But I mean, people know Marxism's bad in their mind, and so that's a reason. And then it goes back to the same idea too, that even like the roots of critical race theory came out of this attempt in legal circles to try to say in the 1980s, hey, it's been a decade and a half since we had the Civil Rights Act passed, and yet we see disproportionate representative of people of color incarcerated in this country. Why is that? Is it possible that our systems are racialized, that it's not just these individual actors, but it's these systems? And I think even something like that, as we've talked about already in this conversation, is just so anathema, especially to white evangelical Christians who don't see systems, they just see individual actors. And so to talk about a racist school system, or, you'll hear about kind of like lampooning the idea of like how the construction of interstate highways in the 1950s were intentionally designed in ways to break up and segregate neighborhoods in this country. And then it gets translated decades later in these discussions of CRT. Oh, this racist is highway, a racist highway. How is that possible when racism is something that individuals do at their heart? And so I think it's right. I think it's a somewhat of a disingenuous reaction to something that is more complicated and nuanced than people want to admit, but it's easy to kind of like hold up as a straw man and to knock down. What I find interesting is the pushback against DEI and the way that that's being carried out, which very much corresponds to these ideas about like doing away with any attention whatsoever to anything that has to do with race or gender for that matter. And so like read in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, just to be safe, last week about how the Defense Department is talking about renaming or stripping Thurgood Marshall and Harriet Tubman and Lucy Stone from the names of naval of ships. Just being like, what is that accomplishing? But they seeing this as, well, that's DEI, and I'm just like, I don't. To me, I don't even know if they understand what they're talking about at this point. When I say they, I mean those who are trying to carry out the scrubbing or doing away with DEI in the nation's defense department.
It kind of just feels like it's a revenge move.
Yeah.
That's based on based on what they think the MAGA constituency would want.
Yeah.
This is just purely from me pulling this out of nowhere, right? Just based on my intuition, but that it's like almost like a revenge move from all of those from 2020 and 2021 and all these statues being removed and all these places being renamed and things like that, for better or for worse, right? I'm not getting into that argument, but what I'm saying is it almost feels like it's just a revenge move and almost feels a little petty. Like, and then like this sense that, I mean, I don't know I've seen the list of books, but I haven't gone through them, right? That have been removed from, I forgot the library.
I think the Naval Academy.
Yeah, the Naval Academy.
We mentioned two of them already on the show. Anthea Butler's and Robbie Jones' book.
You're right. So you get these books being removed, which I'm never really a fan of, right? Necessarily. And especially from like the Naval Academy, like from an academy of adults who are reading is supposed to be learning. Like I don't understand what's going on. And when I look at this, I'm like, man, it certainly doesn't feel like it just seems it puts a lot of ammunition into the argument that there is racism and racially motivated animus and intentions within the powers that be right now.
Yeah.
It seems very unwise. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And or doing these things like removing like Thurgood Marshall, like the name, or like
Thurgood Marshall.
Like,
I mean,
like what are we doing? Like, I don't understand that. That makes absolutely no sense. And it's like, how can, like, I just understand why my friends of color are concerned about what's happening right now. Just to be really frank, and that's an understatement. I just understand why there's a lot of fear and concern about this. And we're just about at time, but I would love to hear your thoughts on our current state of where we are right now, and I just have some practical things next, practical questions. But what's our current state, and do you feel hopeful? Do you feel like what do you imagine the next few years are going to pan out to be based on your study of the past?
Yeah. Well, I will say that I am hopeful, just because as a Christian, I don't know how else to be. I mean, I think that,
I hear you.
So I have to hold on to that. I think I am hopeful. Where I'm most hopeful is the idea that I think we're at a moment in our nation's history in which the church has the possibility in ways that it hasn't, I think, in the entire history of the nation, to be something that is dramatically countercultural to what is happening in the dominant culture. And so I keep saying the church, but one thing historically that I've always found hope in is the Black church in America. And it's the Black church that has always kind of, like, throughout American history, been the site in which, if you're looking for hope, that's where you look. And what I say that, I mean, I teach at an evangelical institution, and primarily to white evangelical students who attend here, who oftentimes can become disillusioned with the church because all they see is their tradition, their branch of the church, which is the white evangelical tradition. And I kind of have to remind them that, the church is a multifaceted tree with different branches. And so within the context of the United States, keeping in mind that the Black church is not a monolith, but if you're looking for folks who have consistently critiqued and stood as a prophetic witness to the broader culture, and yet faithful to Jesus Christ, it has been the Black church in this country. And I think that this is a moment that, as American culture becomes more coarsened and more devoted to the idea of power and might and displays of that if the church can become this site of laying down power and serving rather than making people submissive if the church can be salt and light in a way that I think Jesus calls us to, I think that this is a moment that maybe we have to live out that dramatic witness of the gospel that I think for so long as the church has been wedded to sites of cultural power, it hasn't had that opportunity. I think we're quickly coming to that moment where the church can and should and is called to be a site of hope because it's so radically countercultural to what's happening in the broader society.
Yes.
And to the extent that it's looking for exemplars to do that, as I always tell my students, I think a study of the Black church is a way to kind of like find that hope when things look hopeless.
I think that's a really beautiful point. I really like that. What projects do you have coming up, and how can people connect with you and what you're doing?
I'm writing a religious biography right now of a governor of Alabama named George Wallace, who you might know, but I'm completely fascinated by this project. I'm actually heading down to Montgomery tomorrow to do some more research in the archives of this. But
nice.
I think George Wallace has a lot to teach us as well about what forgiveness and reconciliation looks like. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama who stood in the schoolhouse door, said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever when he was inaugurated as governor of Alabama in 1963. He's governor when Edmund Pettus Bridge had peaceful protesters that were beaten on it. And he is amassing political power for himself when he's actually the leader of the Democratic nominees for president in 1972 when he's shot and paralyzed from the waist down. And Wallace goes on to ask forgiveness and seek forgiveness. Goes into Black churches in Alabama and says, I was wrong about segregation, and seeks the forgiveness of Black Alabamians. And so I'm doing a religious biography of Wallace because I think that he never really overcame that racist part of his past. I mean, that's part of his story is always told in there. Franklin Graham does his eulogy service, and even Franklin Graham, when he's eulogizing George Wallace, still makes this veiled reference to the segregation speech. And so like, even when the guy's like being buried, he's still talking about like, yeah, he was a segregationist. I mean, so he never comes away from it. But
read the room, Franklin.
Frank. But I think that one of the things that fascinates me about George Wallace is just the fact that he so desperately wanted forgiveness, but he doesn't know how to go about and like actually make amends. And so the final chapter of this, I'm kind of comparing him to Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus had this radical encounter with Jesus, and as a result comes back and said, yeah, I really screwed some things up, so I'm going to make amends. And George Wallace did all these things to screw people over, and then he has this radical encounter with Jesus. But then all he's doing is saying, hey, will you forgive me? But then but you were still governor and you had all these opportunities where you could have like changed some things and you still didn't take down the Confederate flag, and you still made it difficult for school busing to take place, and you still supported lawsuits that made it hard to integrate the police force. Anyway, so that's a long rambling answer. George Wallace, that's what I'm working on next.
Are you going to call it like How Not to Christian?
Something like that, right? How not to seek forgiveness, or I think that I'm not sure what it's going to be called, but
that's funny, man. Well, that's super interesting. And people, how can they get a hold of you or connect with what you're doing? Any way? Are you on the social webs?
I kind of stay off of those.
We hear that a lot.
Yeah. I'm not real active anywhere. So,
we'll ask them to pick up the book.
That's right. Pick up the book. And if you want to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to correspond with people that way.
Yeah. And they can go to where to get your email.
Indiana Wesleyan. So indwest.edu. If just Google Rusty Hawkins, Indiana Wesleyan, I come up pretty quickly.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Rusty, for coming on the program, man. It was a real pleasure and super enlightening having this conversation with you.
Hey, thanks again for the invitation, Will, and great to talk to you, Josh. And I appreciate both of you, what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And we appreciate you. And we also appreciate our friends who've joined us here, our viewers, our listeners. Guys, thanks for being here. We want to get this content out to as many people as we can. We think what we're doing is important. As Christians, we think it's a ministry. Just as people, we think it's important, just as members of the human race, to start to bring to light a lot of the issues that we're talking about. And so we'd appreciate if you like, subscribe, do the things that hack the algorithm, share this with people so that we can get this content out to more people who need to hear it. And guys, thanks for joining us again. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Thanks and God bless. Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.